Karine, colleagues, good afternoon, and may I begin really by expressing my apologies for arriving somewhat late. I got in this morning, and my High Commissioner has been chaperoning me from one point to the next, and we got into a situation that is very similar to the Nairobi situation, so I'm really sorry about that. But it is a great pleasure to be back in the United Kingdom, and I have to say the weather today is far better than when I was here last, so I'm very pleased to have warm weather, probably brought some sunshine here. Ladies and gentlemen, RUSI rightly bills itself as one of the world's oldest think tanks. For nearly 2 centuries now, you've heard from some of the world's most distinguished thinkers on war and peace. You've thought through some of the world's most important and pressing security challenges, and you have advised leaders both here and abroad. And I'm really honored and humbled to be here with you today. The last time I was here, we were having a rather terse discussion about Kenya. We were in between 2 elections, and in a very interesting point, because we actually did not know which side we were going to fall. But as I spoke here, I was very sure that our own credentials were going to carry us through, even if we were experiencing a somewhat uncomfortable transition at that time in terms of just the democratic processes of electioneering. Time passed, and I think we've come to be vindicated. And we have generated quite a number of interesting lessons out of the experience of 2017. But I'm glad that RUSI gave us the opportunity to have a very intense, really, discussion, and it was very unpretentious at that time, as I recall, Karine. So I am glad, and it will be interesting to come back and have some of those reflections relating to some of the lessons that we generated out of that experience. Today, I have been asked to do a reflection on the Horn of Africa and basically look at some of the emerging security issues in the Horn. But let me begin by prefacing this, because I'm here on somewhat a bilateral visit, to just say Kenya and the United Kingdom have a long tradition of close cooperation in several areas. One of the most significant of these areas is in defense. And this relationship is guided by a defense cooperation agreement, which we continue to find very, very useful. This tradition of cooperation, of course, dates back to before our independence. And we have worked together even at the time of independence, and in spite of a very vicious liberation war, we worked together to establish mechanisms and structures that were appropriate for a post-independent Kenya. Nearly 60 years later, this alliance remains strong. It rests, if I may say so, on shared interest and shared values. For all our complicated and difficult history, Kenya and the United Kingdom share a commitment to democracy. However messy, however imperfect, and sometimes frustrating the consequences have been, both of us believe that our people have a right to choose their government they wish to have freely, that they have a right to associate, they have a right to speak and worship freely. We believe that the private sector should drive our development, and generally we do not take these freedoms for granted. They are precious, and we stand ready to defend this because they have been part of what defines our relationships and who we are. But like the UK as well, we've shared a very, very strong interest in peace and security, and particularly the peace and security of the Horn of Africa. And just not the Horn of Africa, but the East Africa and the African continent as a whole. Although when you look at the Horn of Africa, we are not yet there because of the character of the threats that we've been facing. The Horn of Africa in particular has been a particularly curious region. Many analysts argue that this could probably be the third most volatile region of the world. You know, they will say, Afghanistan, now Syria, and then they will probably mention the Horn of Africa. Perhaps Sahel can come in these days. But if you think about the trajectory for long periods of time, the Horn of Africa has been seen as one of the most volatile, one of the most fragile regions of the world. In fact, for some of us that have been engaging with this region, we see it as one of the theaters where there's a confluence of a number of threats to international peace and security, all happening at the same time. If you think about the Horn of Africa, think about the scale of displacement, whether it is internal displacement or displacement across the border. Think about collapsing states and fragile governance systems. At one point, we had almost 3 countries collapsing almost at the same time. Think about the threat of piracy and international crimes, such as trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking, piracy. Think about terrorism. Think about ecological fragility, a place where we have had environmental factors really creating a cyclic pattern of drought, of famine, of insecurity, food insecurity, and so forth, environmental degradation, name it. And all these actually come together at the same time. Oftentimes, when you look at other areas, 1 or 2 of these would happen alone. But in the case of the Horn of Africa, they all happen together. More recently, I think it is important to mention that there has been another layer of newer threats that I shall be speaking to in a short while. Now, you will all recall that the Somali Civil War triggered a serious crisis of migration. But more than that, and that led to the infamous characterization of Kenya hosting the largest refugee camps, and this became the starting point of everything Kenyan in relation to international relations. But it also opened the door for terrorist groups and agents such as the Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, the ISIS, which have continued to trouble the entire of the East African region. In fact, today, we see patterns and footprints of the Al-Shabaab going as far south as northern Mozambique. Not long ago, in Bunia in eastern Congo, we began to see the footprints of the Al-Shabaab. And so we are very worried at the footprint that emanates, that finds its home in terms of training, in terms of planning, in terms of execution from Somalia and the Al-Shabaab. Nor is this all. You will all know that the story about piracy flourishing and the disorder that this brought to the maritime trade and the freedom of navigation for a number of years. And the United Kingdom and Kenya were among the countries in the international efforts and interventions that restored sanity in the Western Indian Ocean and Gulf of Aden areas. In recent times, as I have said, and as a consequence of nation-building efforts in Somalia, and we can discuss the elements of this to which both of us have contributed, the region has seen new geostrategic positions by foreign interlocutors that are pursuing various economic, ideological, political, and perhaps security interests. The Red Sea, which connects vital shipping lanes for global trade and energy supplies, has experienced a competition for ports, for logistics hubs, militarization by external actors. In fact, today, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden is witness perhaps to the largest number of foreign fleet and military footprint anywhere in its history. Even if we were to compare this, in spite of it having been the contestation point during the Cold War, I think it is true to say right now we are seeing a footprint that we've never seen in this region. And this has generated huge concerns from both analysts and policymakers. You will all probably know of 1 or 2 meetings on the Red Sea in the recent past. Everybody's been scampering to understand the Red Sea, what is going on, who is there, what are the interests, who is aligning to who and why, and so forth. And I think this indicates the uneasiness with which we feel and probably the lack of information to really dissect the elements of what is becoming an area of great geostrategic competition. On the ground, the rivalry and posturing in this region is generating huge, in our view, political risks. In the case of Somalia, there is no doubt that we have seen what you could generally define as two alliances from outside, particularly from the Middle East, that are translating into support of various forces within the governance structures of Somalia. And this, we believe, that these broad alliances are assumed to support either the national or federal units in the Somali administration. This has caused intense political fracture and diminished the imperative for cooperation between the center and the periphery. The most poignant effect of this has been the emboldening of the Al-Shabaab. Those of us that are looking at the Somali theater believe that the Al-Shabaab is now choosing the time and the place. You know, if you look at the numbers of attacks, if you look at the character of the attacks, if you look at the boldness of the attacks. Terrorism, obviously, is another factor that defines this region's security landscape. Despite remarkable success by AMISOM and other international players in the stabilization of Somalia, Al-Shabaab continues to control huge swaths of territory in Somalia from which it launches attacks both in Somalia and in the neighborhood. The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is also competing for space and has gained inroads in Mogadishu and Puntland. The security situation in Somalia, therefore, remains a great concern for those of us that are contiguous to Somalia. Apart from terror groups' activities in Somalia, terror groups are also springing up in the Great Lakes region, as I've indicated. Here, our country, particularly Kenya and the United States, share interests and values which converge, and the idea has been to continue to provide leadership and cohesion in order to defeat the Al-Shabaab. Now, one of the biggest arguments that we've been having, and I think it is important to put this forward, is the manner in which Al-Shabaab has been internationally characterized. I mean, when you hear the discussions around ISIS or Al-Qaeda, even the language is very different from how Al-Shabaab is discussed. Somewhat there is a degree of tolerance to Al-Shabaab, and I think there is a sense as though Al-Shabaab is taken as being a far-away, regional, lesser problem, probably contained by the neighboring countries, and therefore not of a big risk portfolio. And so you will hear language like, we want to decimate the Al-Shabaab. We want to degrade the Al-Shabaab, which is completely different from the language you hear when policymakers and analysts are discussing ISIS. We want to destroy ISIS. We go to destroy ISIS. But we decimate Al-Shabaab. We degrade Al-Shabaab, you know. And this has been a very interesting language, because when we go to the United Nations Security Council to say we need the Al-Shabaab listed under 1267, then you get a pushback, but you don't get the same pushback if you're talking about ISIS. And it is just something to throw out there and just to reflect about. Is there a terror group that we are happy to coexist along? You know, is there one? And could that one be the Al-Shabaab? Because it is far away, because it is, you know, it is contained somewhat, and because we can deal with it for cheap, you know, basically. Ladies and gentlemen, adverse effects of climate change in some cases provide really the rationale for radicalization and violent extremism. You will know, as I've indicated, this region is characterized by ecological fragility. More recently, we have begun to see phenomena that we've not seen in this region, of flooding because of the rising sea levels. It is characterized by cyclic droughts and famines, chronic food insecurity. displacement of populations within and beyond their borders. And together, all these have created a humanitarian cycle that has increased vulnerability of the population, that has grown dependency, and many times that has reduced the chances for productivity. And so it just renders us to the questions about how do we reduce vulnerabilities to inject productivity so that livelihoods can be restored, but people can claim their future. You know, it's a big question, and I don't think it's one that has been dealt with very, very seriously. More recently, the discovery of potential in hydrocarbon and mineral deposits on the shores and offshore in the Western Indian Ocean coastline has kicked off competition by regional and extra-regional actors. These competing interests and the spillover effect of the Gulf crisis have left Somalia politically and economically fragile. And it's not just Somalia, but I think Somalia has become the epicenter of this contestation. Tensions are also experienced as regional countries endeavor to define their maritime zones boundaries, fueled by the realization of increased potential and importance offered by the blue economy generally. These dynamics have mixed implications on the region's stability and our shared interest. In fact, I wanted just to stop here and introduce this matter as it relates to Kenya and Somalia, because I'm sure those who follow this region will probably be interested. You will know that in 2014, without going far off, in 2014, Somalia approached the ICJ to claim a territory of the maritime zone, which Kenya considers its territory. We submitted objections to the ICJ jurisdiction because we did not believe the ICJ had jurisdiction over this matter for the fact that it is a court of last resort. But we also, having concluded a memorandum of understanding with Somalia to help negotiate any dispute of this kind, we felt that we had not exhausted the mechanisms for resolving this dispute between ourselves, or in the event that Somalia was uncomfortable with this, by using regional or African mechanism or any other mechanisms, including mediation by countries that are friendly to ourselves. Nonetheless, after the court decided that it had jurisdiction over this case, we submitted ourselves to the court and undertook, as a matter of goodwill, to stop any exploration activities that were going on in this area of dispute. Now, this was the case until early this year, when Somalia decided to hold conferences for concessioning in areas that are part of this disputed area. This action we interpreted as provocation. We interpreted as a violation of the judicial process that was ongoing, and we demanded an explanation, including the withdrawal of what we regard as illegal maps by Somalia. Now, fast forward, about 4 weeks ago today, the United Nations Secretary General, in his report to the Security Council, signaled the potential risk of escalation from this maritime border dispute between Kenya and Somalia, in effect, placing this matter on the agenda of the Security Council. This issue, we believe, is the surest demonstration of the effects of commercial interest in the context of a fragile country. We have been witness to an unprecedented provocation by Somalia, as I've indicated, including, as I've indicated, an attempt by the government through a commercial entity to an effort that amounts, in our view, to redrawing the international maritime boundaries between Kenya and Somalia. We have remained restrained in our reaction to this situation. We have firmly demanded the retracting of those maps by Somalia and demanded an explanation of their intention, particularly in view that this matter is before a court. We have sent messages cautioning against any decisions or activities that may infringe on Kenya's territorial integrity, but we have also undertaken a number of numerous efforts to try and resolve this matter. Unfortunately, I have to say, this matter has become a domestic political issue in Somalia. In fact, it has become roped into the electioneering mantra of Somalia. And I think that becomes a very difficult thing when a matter such as this becomes the defining mantra for those that are seeking the election. From where we sit as Kenya, the bottom line is that we will not be available to negotiate the territorial integrity of Kenya, and that all necessary measures to adhere to a sworn constitutional imperative and duty to protect the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of the Republic of Kenya will be deployed. I mean, and I think we have sent a message to say we are not available to cede any territory of Kenya or to negotiate that territory. This, colleagues, is a matter in which I believe our partnership with the UK, as in a number of other countries, could be most productive, because we believe this situation has been precipitated by commercial interest. In fact, Western commercial interests. And we hope that we do not run into a situation that we have seen. I think there are people who would rather cut deals with a government that does not have the policy and legal frameworks to conclude contracts as we understand them. And we have seen this in Africa repeated again and again and again. And I think it is important, in our view, in terms of just the messages we've been sending to all the countries that might have interest, and it is not one or two, that it would be irresponsible to have companies complicate the layers of threats and risks that I've just been outlining here. I think it would not be good business sense, and it would not be responsible trading or investment as far as we are concerned. In view of these emerging challenges facing the region, Kenya, as a country that has actually evolved what you might call a peace doctrine in this region, continues to count on partners, including this country, in terms of addressing what are complex, very complex, and big threats, not just to the region, not just to the well-being of the people of this region, but which have huge ramifications for regional security, but also international peace and security. We continue to work towards strengthening regional bodies in order that we can forge for peaceful coexistence and prosperity of this region. And that is why we've always been calling for the UK and other partners to strengthen mechanisms such as those of IGAD, of the EAC, of the Great Lakes Region Conference, of the African Union Peace and Security Council, and so forth. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our hope that in this regard, the UK's support for AMISOM, which we have seen dithering, and when you talk to people, they're kind of saying, what has been the return to this investment? We are not seeing anything turning around. I think the Somali challenge is not caused solely by Somalia, and therefore we all have an obligation to make sure that Somali turns around, because if it doesn't, then we are going to suffer the consequences that come out of this. And so it is very, very important that support for AMISOM to increase its capability to continue to deal a blow, to continue to actually deal with the Al-Shabaab, to bring it to destruction rather than degrading, becomes very important in terms of the role of the UK. It is also important that this country continues to invest in the creation of good governance. I think anybody, as I said here in 2017, anybody that believes in the democratic values and project must be worried at the assault on democratization. And I think investment in democracy, investment in the people determining their own leadership is key, particularly in this region. When you look at the Horn of Africa region today, whether it is now from Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, I think there is a need to really focus on the question of democratization. And this is important because our investment is going to be guaranteed only by institutions and frameworks that we agree should govern investment and trade. And so I think the value of democratization becomes very important for the prosperity agenda going forward. We also need to evaluate the opportunities at a bilateral level. We are looking with a bated breath on the debate and the developments towards Brexit. And we think there is an opportunity to reimagine the Kenya-UK relationship. You know, we have created a joint working team to look at how can we restructure this relationship in a manner that brings value. But there are also other areas for cooperation, the blue economy, which have been largely unexploited and which we believe have huge potential for development that would benefit both of us. This morning, I spoke to the business community in this country that is interested in Kenya and East Africa. And I underscored the importance of them taking advantage as a first movers. I mean, the UK is a first mover in the East African region historically. But I think we've not taken advantage of that as a country because we've not created a repertoire of tools that can help us translate that first mover advantage into opportunities. And that is why there has been a lot of concerns around what is the role of China, you know, and things like that. I think the idea is really to find out how can we translate advantages that are historical, that are to a certain extent also cultural, that are ideological, into returns for both ourselves. And so we've been discussing about areas of opportunity. We've been discussing about not just the domestic opportunity, but the opportunities in the ESC, conceiving Kenya as a gateway, conceiving Kenya as a bridge into the continental free trade area, which we are launching next week, but also conceiving Kenya as a partner that shares in the same values and commitments of democracy, of peace, and private enterprise. I thank you for your kind attention.